Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Richard Merritt? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the murder, then offer my analysis. Richard Vincent Merritt was born in 1974 in the state of Virginia. His father, Robert Merritt, was an officer in the Air Force. His mother, Shirley Merritt, was a real estate agent. Richard had a brother named Robert Merritt II, who was 9 years older. The brothers were not particularly close, in part because of that age difference. The family moved around quite a bit due to Robert's job in the Air Force. In 1987, Richard's father retired from the Air Force and took a job with a defense contractor in Saudi Arabia. This was a significant step up in pay for the Merritt family. Things had always been tight financially, but now they had more freedom. They lived in a large home and had a driver, a cook, and a person who cleaned the residence. The school that Richard attended in Saudi Arabia did not offer high school classes, so he moved to Georgia, where his older brother Robert lived. After graduating from high school, Richard went to college, where he studied political science. In 1993, Richard's father had heart failure and had to quit his high-paying job in Saudi Arabia. Richard's parents moved back to the United States and bought a 4-bedroom house in Stone Mountain, Georgia. During his time in college, Richard met a woman named Janine. They eventually became romantically involved. Richard earned a law degree from a college in Jackson, Mississippi. In 1999, he and Janine married. At this time, she was studying veterinary medicine, so both Richard and Janine were on their way to careers as professionals. In 2000, Richard passed the bar exam on the third try. He eventually became a civil litigator for a law firm in Georgia. In November of that same year, Richard's father died. Shirley was devastated by this loss. In 2003, Richard bought a house in Smyrna, Georgia. He and his wife had a son in 2004 and a daughter in 2006. In 2010, Richard opened a law practice in Smyrna. He worked on personal injury cases and criminal defense. During this time, Richard and his family lived a life of luxury. They went on frequent vacations and had a beautiful house. Gaining wealth was the reason that Richard became an attorney, so he should have been pleased with the outcome. Unfortunately for Richard, he wanted more and found a new and creative way to make money as an attorney. Between April of 2014 and February of 2016, Richard had taken over $400,000 from about 15 clients. Richard was settling malpractice cases and then putting the settlement money in his pocket. In April of 2017, he was arrested for stealing about $70,000. He turned himself in and was released on $2,000 bond. The police investigated and discovered his other theft activity. In January of 2018, he was arrested again and faced additional charges. By this time, he had already lost his license to practice law. As Richard was sitting in jail with his bail set at $400,000, Janine filed for divorce and gained custody of their 2 children. Shirley took out a home equity line for $40,000, 10% of the bail, so she could free her son using a bail bond company. Richard lived in her house in Stone Mountain, Georgia. He had lost his marriage, his children, his house, and just about all his money. In January of 2019, Richard Merritt pleaded guilty to the theft charges and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judge gave him 2 weeks to report to prison in order to get his affairs in order. Richard had to wear an ankle bracelet so that law enforcement could monitor his movements. Despite facing this long sentence, Richard was hopeful that he would only serve about 5 years in prison. Now moving to the timeline of the murder. On February 1, 2019, the day that Richard was supposed to surrender to prison, he never showed up. At 4:14 p.m., the ankle bracelet stopped transmitting. The police went to the last known location of the ankle bracelet, a gas station in Cartersville, Georgia. They found it damaged in a trash can behind the gas station. It had been cut off Richard's ankle. As this was going on, one of Richard's cousins became worried about Shirley. The cousin entered Shirley's house the next day, February 2. At the bottom of the basement stairwell, he found 77-year-old Shirley Merritt dead. The cousin notified the police. Here's what they found during the course of their investigation. Shirley had been stabbed in the face and back with a kitchen knife from her kitchen. The attack involved so much force, the handle had broken. The blade was lodged in Shirley's face. A 35-pound dumbbell was used to bludgeon her in her face. The police found it not far from where her body was, with blood on it. Shirley died from a combination of blunt force injury and stab wounds. Her 2009 Lexus RX 350 SUV was missing, but Richard's vehicle was still at the house. Investigators believe that Shirley was cooking Richard's last meal before prison when he attacked her with the knife and dumbbell. The police could not locate Richard. It was like he vanished into thin air. The first significant lead in the case arrived in September of 2019, 8 months after the murder. The police in Nashville, Tennessee, investigated a motor vehicle break-in. The vehicle was a 2009 Lexus RX 350. The license plate did not match the vehicle, which led the police to discover that the SUV belonged to Shirley Merritt. Inside the vehicle, the police found various items like receipts to a few different stores and flyers from a bar. These items led them to the Vanderbilt neighborhood of Nashville. On September 30, 2019, U.S. Marshals spotted Richard entering a thrift shop. He was there to buy a light jacket because it was getting colder outside. They managed to arrest him without incident. Richard was returned to Georgia, where he was charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a knife while committing a felony. For violating his probation, Richard was sentenced to another 15 years in prison. This was on top of his 15-year sentence for theft. At Richard's murder trial, he testified in his own defense. He admitted to stealing money from clients, but denied committing murder. Here is the story that Richard Merritt offered to explain what happened to his mother. Not long before he was supposed to report to prison, he noticed a series of mysterious occurrences. He kept receiving phone calls where the caller would hang up. Several suspicious motor vehicles drove around the cul-de-sac where his mother's house was located, and a cartoon had been sent to his mother's house. Richard believed that someone was out to get him. On February 1, 2019, Richard said that 2 men knocked on the front door of his mother's house. Despite all the alleged threats, Richard decided to open the door. The men produced pistols and demanded entry. As they were forcing Richard and his mother down to the basement, Shirley was pushed down the steps. One of the men bludgeoned her with a dumbbell, and the other man stabbed her with a kitchen knife. When they were done committing the murder, they showed Richard images of his ex-wife and children on a cell phone. The killers told Richard not to say anything about the murder, or they would be the next victims. Richard decided to follow the killer's instructions and didn't tell anybody what happened. He took his mother's SUV, drove to Nashville, Tennessee, and started a new life. On May 24, 2023, Richard Merritt was convicted of all charges after the jury deliberated for 90 minutes. It's not clear what they were doing for 89 of those minutes. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 5 years. At his sentencing, he said, quote, "I was raised by 2 beautiful people and had a beautiful wife and children. The world was our oyster, and I blew it over the worst drug there is, the green money. I made a lot of bad choices and decisions," unquote. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1. Even though Richard maintains his innocence, there is no doubt that he killed his mother. His story about the 2 mysterious intruders doesn't make any sense. He would have people believe that these 2 men killed his mother and left him alive. They didn't steal anything or have any other obvious motive. After witnessing the actions of these monsters, as Richard called them, he decided to run away and start a new life instead of contacting the authorities. All this conveniently happened on the day Richard was supposed to report to prison. When he was describing the murder on the stand, Richard said something like, "I could not believe what I was seeing." Apparently, the jury couldn't believe it either. I have watched the closing arguments for many different trials. I don't know if I've ever seen one as deficient as the one offered by the state in this case. It was absolutely disastrous. The prosecutor essentially just said that Richard was guilty. It's like she forgot the argument part of her closing argument. Her performance was so bad, I wondered if she had attended the Richard Merritt School of Law. Fortunately, the jury didn't need a good closing argument to find Richard guilty. Item number 2, Richard acted like he was the victim when he testified on the stand. He talked about how his own stealing behavior cost him everything, but then focused on the surprising homicidal attack as if he had nothing to do with it. He tried to convince the jury that people had been conspiring against him. Richard did not really express any emotions, even when describing how the non-existent intruders murdered his mother. He offered a high level of detail, answered questions in a matter-of-fact manner, and was precise, but ultimately his testimony was thoroughly unconvincing. If Richard had any talent as a lawyer, it was not on display during his testimony. Item number 3, after the murder, documents were found which supported the theory that Shirley had been taken advantage of by Richard. His mother had given him money, he had borrowed her money, and allegedly he had taken her money. In addition to the home equity line to bail out her son, Shirley had pawned some of her belongings. Richard owed his mother over $500,000. There was a pattern of Richard having money problems. For example, when he was testifying on the stand, he mentioned how, when he was first arrested, his bond was set at $2,000. Instead of simply paying it, he went to a bail bond company and paid them $200. It's common for these companies to charge 10% of the bond. There are a lot of people who don't have $2,000 sitting around, but Richard was an attorney with his own practice. In addition, he had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from clients. Where did it all go? It sounds like he was living a lifestyle positioned well above his means. Item number 4, during the 8 months when Richard lived his new life in Nashville, Tennessee, he used the alias Mick Malvo. He engaged in online dating, met a new girlfriend, and found a job at a bar. On his fake driver's license, he made himself 6 years younger. There's this sense that Richard really didn't have any long-term plan, but he was not going to let being wanted for murder slow down his social life. After he was returned to Georgia, his lover did not want anything to do with him, mostly because of the murder part, but Richard was not willing to give up on his dream. He sent his lover postcards and tried to call her. Item number 5, what do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Richard was impulsive, irresponsible, grandiose, self-centered, materialistic, deceptive, believed himself to be special, had a sense of entitlement, and loved being the center of attention. He had success as an attorney, but he desired even more money. Richard started stealing from his clients with no concern for long-term consequences. He was focused on living in the moment. When his behavior caught up with him, his mother was the only one who stood by him. Richard extracted everything he could from his mother. In his mind, she was simply a source of money. He did not have any affection for her. When incarceration time arrived, Richard was having second thoughts. 15 years in prison didn't sound as fun as it initially sounded. Even the 5 years that he thought he would serve was not appealing. He and his mother became involved in an argument about this topic, and he killed her. There really wasn't any type of plan. If Richard had planned this, he would not have waited until the day he was supposed to report to prison. This was an impulsive crime, which was not based on shame. It's not like he killed his mother because he was ashamed of his behavior and did not want her to see it. If having shame was a crime, Richard would be found not guilty of that offense. Now moving to my final thoughts. Richard Merritt was an atypical offender as far as committing matricide. For example, he was not psychotic. He had the ability to become a lawyer, barely, and, for a while, appeared to be successful. He only resorted to murder after he had lost everything. I think the lesson learned in this case is how it's critical to watch out for those who are recklessly hedonistic and who have no objection to extreme violations of trust. Those are my thoughts in the case of Richard Merritt. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.